We're joined by Annette Young, who's the host of our weekly show all about women shaping our world today. That's, of course, 51%. Annette, we heard in that report that the French government is very much moving to close the pay gap. But just how do we compare to other European nations?
We fall somewhere in the middle, Sanam. I mean, if you're in Estonia, put it this way, I don't think you would want to be working there as a woman because the pay gap is as large as 28%. Now, you contrast that to the other end of the scale. And what's interesting, as we discovered when we did this special at the 51%, is actually some of the better performing countries, such as Romania, not necessarily a nation you would think of, Italy, Belgium and Luxembourg, where it sort of fell between 6 to 7%. And just coming back to that statistic of 9%, I mean, that is for people, men and women, working in full-time job, or more importantly, women working in full-time employment. If you look in a broader scale at women working casually or part-time, it goes up to somewhere between 13 to 15%. It is a big issue. So what is the French government trying to do about all this? They're going to give companies 3 years to effectively get their act together and bring in a new computer system which is going to have a look at people's payrolls and see where indeed there are unjustifiable gaps, and as a result they have to correct it. And if they don't do it, they're eligible for a fine which will total somewhere in the order of 1% of their wage bill.
That's extraordinary, 6 to 20%, as you're saying, the disparity in Europe. Now, the other key element in the government's equality strategy is a tough crackdown on sexual harassment in public spaces, which I'm sure many women will be embracing. But will that be enough?
This is the really interesting thing. I mean, it is a fairly harsh law. I mean, they're talking about with this legislation imposing fines that will begin with the minimum of €90 if a man is found to be making inappropriate comments on a woman's appearance or about her body in a public space. But it comes obviously against the backdrop of the Me Too campaign, or as it was known here in France, Balance ton porc, which translated into English roughly means squeal on your pig. I actually sat down with the Gender Equality Minister, MARLENE Schiappa, earlier this week to talk about the legislation, and let's just take a listen to what she had to say.
It's a cultural problem. Some things have been accepted for years, for generations, for a long time. People thought, oh, well, that's just the way it is. It doesn't matter. Boys will be boys. These things were accepted, but they are not accepted any longer. And I think it is the role of the law, because the French Republic can say what we tolerate, what we don't tolerate, and indeed we do not tolerate to see women harassed or threatened in the street or in public transportation.
Now, what was really interesting, Sanam, when I sat down with the Minister, when we were talking about this array of issues that clearly fall into N-Train, especially about sexual harassment, she talked about having to change cultural mindsets. And we're in a country here in France where the way in which men and women interact is very different as to what we're used to in English-speaking countries. For instance, the famous bisou, the biz, or as we refer to it, where men and women, not only in a social environment, but at work, will kiss each other on the cheek. And that automatically makes it somewhat awkward in terms of interaction, especially if you're a woman kissing your boss. So this is, when you look at the legislation and what they're proposing, and basically what they're talking about is basically realigning the way in which men and women interact with one another in public and private spaces. It's really interesting. It is particularly innovative in a culture which I have to say is probably, by Anglo standards, not so much backwards, but has a rather different approach to the way that men and women interact with one another.
It'd be interesting to follow the developments in that, because I myself are quite uncomfortable with that bees culture here in France. And thank you very much for bringing us the latest on France's strategy of dealing with gender equality.